Hello and welcome to another edition of the Waypoint podcast, where we go over Torah insights from the weekly Parsha. This week's Parsha is a fascinating one. A lot happens in this one. There's a lot going on, and my colleague Seamus will have a wonderful lesson in store pertaining to all of a lot that happens. But before that, just to go over the wave tops of what happens in this week's Parsha real quick, we begin with the lighting of the menorah, and then we move from that to the consecration and redemption of the Levites. From there, we get the second round of commandments regarding Pesach and the institution of Pesach. We get a discussion on Israel's camp movements from there and the movements under the presence of Hashem in the form of a cloud. From there, Hashem gives commandments concerning the forming of a shofar and when to blow it and how to blow it. Then the children of Israel get rather whiny about their diet at this point, and they want some meat, and so Hashem sends them far more quail than they desired. Then Miriam, Moses' sister, has some complaints about his wife for being a Cushite for some reason. Not just Miriam, Aaron also, and ultimately Miriam is the one that we see as being punished for that. And there is ultimately a level of mercy shown. Moses appeals to Hashem on her behalf, and so her punishment only lasts for 7 days. That's pretty much where our Parsha ends, and with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to my colleague for his wonderful lesson today. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Parasha Beha'alotcha. It's a longer one than normal as far as the word for the title, Beha'alotcha. So yeah, this is, as Brad said in the opening, there's a lot going on here. And what I wanted to focus on mostly is a particular area about, so between some of the complaining is the founding of the Sanhedrin, the first Sanhedrin. It's not yet called the Sanhedrin. Technically, that the title Sanhedrin is a Greek word. It would be called that much later on down the road. But the 70 elders, the Great Assembly, the Supreme Court of the Bible, is being established right here in Torah. The Sanhedrin, essentially. And I noticed some things in my studies, particularly about the founding of the Sanhedrin, some of the wording that's used, and the context surrounding the founding of the Sanhedrin. The first thing I noticed was, one, this Torah portion is full of complaining. There's so much complaining from everybody. Everyone is complaining about something. Humans, we love to complain. Even when things are good, we like to look for things to complain about. It's just something we love to do, to a fault even, and obviously to a fault here in the Torah. And I think that highlights what essentially the message that I pulled away from this Torah portion this week. It's highlighting the essential problem while also offering the essential solution. So we've got the complaining for the manna and wanting some meat. The quail is given more than they bargained for, but they still get it. And then we have the founding of the Sanhedrin. This is where things in my studies, this is where things got interesting. So I noticed in reading it, Esfa li shivim ish is the Hebrew there for gather to me 70 men. Now, something I wanted to point out, Esfa li shivim ish. That's weird. Because the rest of that, gather to me, easy day, Esfa li, gather to me, shivim, 70 ish, man. Gather to me 70 man. It's singular. It should be plural. And Noshim would be a lot more appropriate here in Noshim, gather me 70 men, but instead it's Ish, which I find fairly interesting. So I wanted to see what anyone had to say about the apparent grammatical error. Of course, Rashi is the master of commentators when it comes to grammatical quote unquote errors in the Torah. But actually, what I found the most interesting is in the Midrash Rabbah, specifically Bamidbar Rabbah, section, well, really page 15. Excuse me, not page 15. 15, Safim 23. Yes. And they're commenting specifically about this particular error, and they put it together because it's a midrash. They're puzzling together other verses that have a similar setup, a sort of the same, very close in its structure and its DNA, something about it, where they can line up many of the passages and create what is this essentially a doctrine or some sort of connection between the various passages that have a similar layout, like a puzzle piece where they fit together. And where the Midrash picks up is it basically tells a short story about what God was asking for. What was God asking for when he said, gather to me 70 men? The reason he used the word Ish is he was specifically asking for God to gather unto him 70 unique individual men who are just like me and you, said God to Moses. So find 70 people that have the qualities of you and I. Interestingly enough. And where does the Midrash justify this? Exodus 15:3, Hashem is a man, Ish, of war, and Moses later on in this Torah portion in Bamidbar 12 verse 3, Moses was exceedingly humble. And it says now the man, Ish, Moses was exceedingly humble. So we're actually lining up the word man here, Ish, to gather the qualifications of what we're looking for in these men. Men of war and humble men. Very interesting. So the 70 elders are to be humble warriors, essentially. Very fitting, seeing as Moses himself is sort of a humble warrior. We know he was a humble man, a leader, an officer sort of his own army, the army of the Israelites. Hashem, of course, being the Hashem Tzvaot, the master of battalions, as we spoke about a couple of weeks ago. So he is a warrior himself, and we are ourselves warriors. But what does it take precisely to be a leader of this battalion, this Tzvaot, of a division, right? The Midrash goes on to make another connection about the kind of person that God is looking for, and Moses are looking for the members of the Sanhedrin, with this little story about a man named Shmuel HaKatan. Samuel. HaKatan means the little or the small. His namesake comes from, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, because he was constantly looking for ways to make himself smaller, i.e., he would refuse honors. You know, he was humble, and he was looking for ways to try and not be as noticeable and brag about his accomplishments. He was always humbling himself, so he was nicknamed Shmuel HaKatan, the little. And in the caveat of this story in the Midrash, it talks actually about a prayer that many of us might be familiar with. That prayer is the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings, or the Amidah for short. Now, many of you might already know this, but there's actually 19 blessings in the Shmona Esrei, even regardless of the name. And the additional blessing was added by Gamliel of Yavna, and this was after the destruction of the Second Temple. And he was hoping to solidify and capture for essentially the rest of time what the Shemona Esrei was, so that we could write it down so it wouldn't be forgotten, because without the temple being the central location for all of Jewish practice and authority, the oral traditions might get lost. Whereas before, you had everyone there to test to check everybody. Everything was right there. There was no worries about knowledge being lost per se. But now that's no longer the case. The Jewish people are being scattered. The temple is destroyed. So now they're beginning to write down the Shemona Esrei. Now, when it came to this additional blessing, Gamliel, he decided that the blessing it's been in and out of the Shemona Esrei throughout Jewish history, depending on different contexts in Jewish past, in historical Israel past. When the people were in a time of war or before battle, or when they were being heavily oppressed, sometimes they would add in this additional blessing against heresy or against informers, spies, people trying to demolish, commit genocide, whatever, to the Jewish people. They would sometimes add it. And in times of peace or relative peace, it wouldn't be there. So it just depended contextually. It was always in and out, sometimes there, sometimes not. So Gamliel decided, now that the Jewish people are going into permanent exile, essentially, it should be written down, and it should be a permanent, should have a permanent place in the prayers now moving forward. However, because it was always kind of in and out, it was composed differently. And so it talks about how Gamliel, an incredibly humble man himself, by the way, he's a very famous person in Mishnah, in Talmud. He is a disciple, of course, of Hillel. And Hillel, of course, as well, was exceedingly humble himself, a great leader, a great teacher. Gamliel thought himself not good enough to compose the blessing against heresy. And so he petitioned, who among us could be worthy or humble enough to compose such a blessing? What a strange thought. So the composition of the blessing has nothing to do with the poetry. Anyone who's good with a pen, good with words even, could theoretically compose the blessing against heresy. But Gamliel understood something that we're looking over here, that you need to be very careful with how you approach a blessing concerning the condemnation of informers, spies, heresy, or people that wish ill will upon the Jewish nation. Because what you don't want to do is push away with both hands. In the Talmud, on page 47 Alpha, is a famous saying. It's one of my favorite sayings. Push away with your left hand, but draw near with your right hand. That is essentially to say, you should rebuke, but with your weak hand. You should do so softly. You should not do so permanently or strongly with your strong hand. Whenever you send somebody away or push away a heresy, or you make a correction of some sort, you do so with your weaker hand, with gentleness, right? You don't lash out. And the opposite is true when it comes to drawing somebody near. You draw them in with your strong hand. You pull them in wholeheartedly, and you hold on to them with the strong hand. And what Gamliel was trying to do was follow this advice. And it is written of Shmuel HaKatan that he essentially lived by this rule. Many things are spoken of him, especially in Pirkei Avot, about just how he would recite a proverb all the time about not wishing ill will even on your enemies. And so he essentially was the perfect man for the job, because he understood that being empty of your own self is how you become a good leader against enemies, for people and against enemies. Vengeance is not something that is smiled upon, for sure, biblically, I'm sure, as you understand. And so people that go to war for vengeance or for glory, warriors are necessary. That it's even something that's a positive trait, biblically speaking. But the motivation for going to war needs to be, or the motivation for being in battle needs to be correct. Now, typically speaking, warriors, especially in the heat of battle, understand this idea of emptying yourself in order to lead properly. This concept, by the way, there's a Hebrew phrase for it, of sort of emptying yourself. It's called bitul hayesh. Bitul hayesh. Bitul means sort of negligent, canceled, not really there, insignificant. That's sort of what it means. So small that it basically doesn't register. That's bitul. It's just not really even there. Yesh means yourself, or a thing. It means different things, but in this particular context, it basically means for bitul hayesh. It means emptying yourself or considering yourself small, like Shmuel HaKatan. And the opposite is true if you call a person a yesh. You're basically saying he's full of himself rather than he is not full of himself. He is selfless. So bitul hayesh. This is essentially the goal, and this is what you are looking for in a good leader. A solid leader in any context is a person who is a bitul hayesh, is somebody who is goal oriented. He is not full of himself. He doesn't do things for his own selfish reasons, his own glory, for his own fame. He's doing it for the mission and for the goal, whatever that might be. And in our case, for Hashem. In the case of a warrior, you can ask any veteran who's been in the combat, just why did you do it? The question is always the same. I didn't do it for me. I didn't do it for any government. I did it for the guy next to me. And it's this idea of emptying. He was emptying himself in that moment because the battle's not about him. It's about mission accomplishment and keeping the guy next to you alive. That is what makes a good leader. The selfish people don't do well in a war zone because you can't trust them. They do everything for themselves, and that's not how you get a mission accomplished. So that's the kind of leadership we're looking for. Empty leaders. People who are selfless, who have emptied themselves so much to the point that the only thing they could possibly be filled with is with God's Spirit. And that's what happens essentially next as we establish the pouring out of the Spirit onto the members of the Sanhedrin. They get a portion of Moses' Spirit. The only way they could possibly have received such a blessing is if they were essentially just an empty vessel ready to receive this Spirit of God. And that's the kind of person that makes a fantastic leader. One who empties himself, the bitul hayesh, the person who considers himself very little. And when it comes to Shmuel HaKatan, it's very important to understand that if you write that blessing in the wrong way, you could arouse all of the wrong and improper feelings, feelings of vengeance. You could even accidentally, with some words, create an uprising, a sort of rebellion in all of the wrong ways. And instead of not wishing ill will even upon your enemies, you have a ton of people over time in history, in memoriam, from this point forward, and definitely in Judaism, praying an improper prayer. And that was what Gamliel understood was incorrect. That he did not want that to happen. It needed to be appropriate, and he needed to be careful. And only a person who was completely void of himself and filled only with God's Spirit could compose such a blessing. And that's actually a little bit, there you go, of the history of the 19th blessing of Shemona Esrei against heretics. And we say heretics, it really means against traitors, I would say, is a better translation. Somebody who is part of the community but turns on them in a sort of spying way, or a backhanded, underhanded, under the table, very treasonous sort of way. It's not just heresy, like people that believe the wrong things. That's not what that word means. It doesn't equate to that. It's more about somebody who is considered a member who turns his back and sells out, is a spy, informer for the enemy, or who means physical harm to the Jewish people or genocide against the Jewish people. There have been many of those in history. That's what that prayer is directed at. And even then, when you read it, you get a sense for this is God's doing, and we're just praying that he does it. It's not for us to do. So what is the takeaway for this lesson? You can work on yourself to be this kind of leader. It takes time, takes experience. These were 70 elders for a reason, of course. And in the greater scheme of things, when we were talking about this portion, there are so many people that are complaining all the time. These people are complaining over here. people complaining over there. Even Miriam complains about Moses' wife. This is full of complaining. And the only complaint that we see that is proper is Moses' complaint, because his complaint is selfless. He is talking about he is not able to take care of the Jewish people by himself. He's not complaining essentially that he doesn't want to do it or that it's too hard for him. It's rather very clear that he wishes he had the capacity to be more, but he simply is human and he cannot. And that's why his is granted in a much more soft-handed way. There are some of the complaints in the portion are granted, but in a more heavy-handed way or in a more lesson-providing way. But the Sanhedrin isn't. It is a foundation that is set firm forever as the basis for all biblical authority and halachic rulings from this point forward. And that's the difference. While everyone else is focused on themselves, I'm hungry, I want meat. Your wife is too good for you. Things like these different complaints, Moses is essentially lamenting that he isn't enough. And that's the kind of leadership that we can aspire to be. We can work on ourselves to do this. This is a discipline. Warriors always work on discipline. It's something anyone who is a warrior can tell you. It's discipline, but it's doable. You can learn to be an amazing leader. You can learn to empty yourself. And Yeshua said it himself, that you have to empty yourself, just as he empties himself, Paul points out, and he even emptied himself, even to death on a cross. His obedience and his discipline were just that good. And he thought not of himself, but he thought of everyone that was in his charge first. And so that's my takeaway for this week. Hope you enjoyed the lesson. And now I will turn it back over to my compatriot, Brad. Shalom.
Welcome back. And thank you, Seamus, for that incredible lesson. For this week's Haftarah connection, it's fairly simple, pretty short and sweet. Immediately right off the bat, I'm sure you also noticed that the menorah also plays a pretty substantial role in the Haftarah as well as the Parsha. And immediately following the menorah is another redemption, another consecration, but not of the Levites of this time. It would be of Israel. And we even have at the center of all this a empty leader, like Seamus was speaking about. And this empty leader is none other than Yehoshua, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. What's in a name? I'll leave that for you to figure out. But I do hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and hope that you come back for more next week. If you want to see more content like this and some of the other content that we've got, you can certainly visit the website and search for other videos on our YouTube. If you'd like to become a donating member, that option is available on the website as well as the Patreon. Both are still up. So certainly, please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, ring that bell, and we hope to see you next time. Shalom.